Welcome to the deep dive. We're really unpacking the history of Armenia today, and we're using this detailed source material that a listener shared. It's quite a story, spans millennia.
It really does. And as we dig into this text, you'll see few peoples have a history quite this ancient, this complex. They went from being, some of the earliest settled communities to forming major kingdoms of their own.
Always caught between empires, it seems.
Always at the crossroads, yeah. And what really jumps out right from the early sections in the source is how foundational their conversion to Christianity was.
Absolutely. The material makes it so clear, becoming the first nation officially to adopt Christianity back in the early 4th century. That was just a defining moment, shaped everything after. So our mission here is to kind of pull out the most important bits, the key insights from this deep dive into the source, just to give you a clearer picture of this, frankly, remarkable history. Let's dive in right at the start, the very distant past.
Okay, yeah. So the earliest layers the source talks about, it points to evidence back in the Lake Sevan Basin. We're talking around the 10th millennium BC, among the very first Neolithic settlements.
Wow, 10,000 BC. That's really going back. And the text details those early signs of, civilization starting.
It does. It mentions agriculture, pottery making, right around that 10th millennium mark. Then you fast forward a bit, 8th millennium BC, and you see animal husbandry, metallurgy developing.
Okay, the building blocks. What about towns, beliefs, that sort of thing?
Well, the source tells us the first actual urban settlements pop up between the 7th and 5th millennium BC. And alongside that, you get trade, industry, and more complex religious beliefs taking shape.
And is this where the ancestors of the Armenians themselves entered the picture?
The text suggests, the Proto-Armenians. They seem to have migrated into the area, maybe from Central Asia, maybe Iran, maybe both, somewhere between the 5th and 4th millennium BC. And these groups, they eventually become part of the state that forms, known as Urartu.
Urartu. Right, the source definitely flags that as a major power.
Oh, yeah. The kingdom of Urartu, running from about the 9th to the 6th centuries BC, it's presented as the most powerful state in what the source calls ancient Armenia. Its territory was huge, modern Armenia, bits of Turkey, northwest Iran.
Quite a reach.
Definitely. Hit its peak in the 8th century BC, capital at Erebuni, this big fortress. The source even lists some of their main gods, Kaldi, Taisheba, Shivini.
And what made Urartu stand out based on this material? What were their big achievements?
The paper points out a few key things. They were apparently among the first in the Middle East to really develop that citadel fortress style, those massive fortified strongholds.
Right.
They used cuneiform script, that early writing system. They have this interesting concept of a common village territory centered around a fortress. And crucially, water management. They built these big reservoirs for farming and had what the source actually calls a national water policy.
A national water policy back then. That's impressive.
It really is. Oh, and grapes were a big crop for them, too. Interestingly, though, the source notes their language, Urartian, still undeciphered. A bit of a mystery.
Huh. So the key takeaway from Urartu is this early, pretty sophisticated level of state organization and technology for the time.
Exactly. It sets a precedent, for complex administration and resource management way back then.
So how did things shift towards, an explicitly Armenian kingdom?
Well, the source says the Proto-Armenians basically established their own country in the 6th century BC. It mentions the Urartu dynasty founding a kingdom, actually, back in the 7th century BC.
Okay, and that leads us towards the classical period and a name you often hear connected with Armenia, Tigranes the Great.
Yes, Tigranes II the Great, ruled 95 to 55 BC. The source describes his kingdom as really expanding parts of Asia Minor, northern Syria, the kingdom of Iberia over in Georgia. His big victory over the Seleucids, that brought a lot of prosperity, a lot of fame.
He sounds like he was a major player on the world stage then.
Oh, for sure. The source notes he had the title King of Kings. Cities were named after him. He minted his own coins, even got an embassy visiting from Italy. It was definitely a political and military high point for that early kingdom.
Okay, so Armenia is established now, but it's in that tricky spot, right? Between huge empires. How did they handle that, according to the source?
Yeah, the material really emphasizes that difficult location. Between the Persians, later the Romans, they managed to stay independent from Alexander the Great, which is pretty impressive in itself. But eventually, they became subjects of Rome.
And that relationship with Rome, especially around the 1st century BC, sounds quite involved.
Very involved, yeah. Under the Artaxiads, the source talks about this kind of arms race happening in the Caucasus, which just fueled instability. And Rome used this system of client kingdoms.
Right, where local rulers keep some power but have to toe the Roman line.
Pretty much. Local authority, yes, but foreign policy had to align with Rome. Lots of diplomacy, espionage, the whole deal.
So Armenian kings must have felt immense pressure.
The source is really clear on this. It was precarious. Cooperate enough, be seen as a tributary or a friendly state, and you might survive. But if you didn't show, considerable cooperation, the source basically says you'd fall into oblivion. Simple as that.
There's a great little anecdote in the source about that time, something about buried treasure.
Ah, yeah. It mentions Tigranes burying treasures when he was retreating from the Roman general Sulla. And then later, this hoard of Roman coins minted by Pompey was found on Armenian land. The source connects it right back to that specific conflict. It's just a small, tangible link,
Cool. Okay, so this is where the story takes that massive turn we mentioned earlier, Christianity. What was the religious scene before the big conversion?
Well, at the start of the 1st century, the source indicates Zoroastrianism was the official state religion, which makes sense, given the ties to Persia at the time.
But Christianity itself was around before it became official.
According to the tradition cited in the text, yeah. Armenian historians place it way back in the apostolic era, linking it to the apostles Thaddeus and Bartholomew. And the source points out that Eusebius, the historian, supports this in his Chronicon, actually calling Armenia the first nation to accept Christianity as its state religion.
So the official conversion wasn't the start of Christianity there, but when it became the state's religion.
Exactly. The source says it became the state religion by 314 AD. Although it does also mention 301 AD as a possible date. There's a little variation there. It talks about St. Gregory the Illuminator playing a key role, sometimes linked with King Truckut the Great. And there was this council in 301, apparently held right on the ruins of an old Zoroastrian temple. Symbolism there.
And crucially, the church adopted the Armenian language.
Yes, hugely significant. Yeah. And that leads right into the creation of the Armenian alphabet.
Yeah.
Why was that such a game changer?
Well, the source really stresses how fundamental this was. Mes-Rop-Mashtots creates the alphabet in 405 AD. And it wasn't just, for writing things down. It opened the floodgates for this extensive literature starting in the 5th century, translations of the Bible, other sacred texts, original works.
It became part of their identity.
Exactly. As the source explains, the alphabet became this indispensable element of Armenian identity, Armenian culture. Absolutely vital for preserving their unique heritage, especially in that turbulent region.
So the key insight here is adopting Christianity, creating the alphabet. These weren't just religious or linguistic things. They were deeply tied into survival, into preserving who they were.
Precisely. The source explains choosing Christianity meant rejecting paganism. It set them apart. And that religious distinctiveness, plus their unique language and alphabet, became core to their identity. But it also, put them on a collision course with later empires who persecuted Christians. The source talks about the suffering of Armenians in that context as being, unique.
So, as we shift into the Middle Ages, Armenia finds itself dealing with new powers rising around them.
Yes, the arrival of the Arabs really marks this next phase. Arab domination runs from the mid-7th century to the early 10th. The source describes it as a time of, fragmentation. It shattered the old social and religious structures, although, interestingly, a kind of distinct Armenian territory did persist through it.
But they did regain independence for a while.
They did, yeah.
Yeah.
Under the Bagratuni dynasty, they rose to prominence between the 9th and 11th centuries, mainly as the Arab caliphate started to weaken. But, and the source highlights this, they really struggled to form one single strong kingdom.
Why was that?
Geography played a part, population density wasn't always enough, and critically, internal rivalries. You had these different Armenian princely houses often competing, which led to this pattern of multiple smaller states instead of one unified front.
And then came another wave of invaders, the Seljuks. The Seljuk Turks, starting around the 1050s. The source paints their arrival as just devastating for agricultural Armenia. Widespread destruction, people forced into exile, huge migrations westward. It even notes that these Armenian refugees ended up contributing to the establishment of Turkish culture over in Anatolia, a major turning point, and demographically and culturally.
And that seems to be what led to a new Armenian kingdom starting up, but further south.
That's right, the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia, founded in 1071 down in southern Asia Minor. The source presents it as this pretty significant buffer state. It had a real period of flourishing, especially under King Levon II. He got the title King of Armenia in 1198.
And connections to Europe?
Strong ties, yeah. The source mentions support from the French crown, links to the Crusades, and adopting European cultural and Christian traditions. It was outward-looking in many ways.
But it didn't last forever either.
No. It faced its own downfall. The Mongol Empire's invasion, first half of the 13th century, that was a massive blow. Led to economic decline, cultural stagnation, and eventually, Cilician Armenia lost its independence in the 15th century.
So the whole medieval period seems to be this constant balancing act, trying to survive between these huge neighboring empires while also dealing with divisions at home.
That's exactly how the source sums it up. Navigating relations with Persia, Byzantium, the Arab Caliphate. While internal splits often made it harder to, present that unified strength, the key insight really is this persistent struggle just to exist amidst these overwhelming external forces.
Okay, so after Cilician Armenia falls, the source talks about a long stretch under Ottoman and Persian rule.
Yeah, centuries of foreign domination. And the source explains that partly because that earlier Seljuk depopulation, a lot of the historic Armenian heartland ended up under Ottoman control, but in areas where the Armenian communities had already been drastically reduced. So it led to this kind of irreparable loss of the ancestral territory.
But their sense of identity, their national consciousness, it survived all that.
According to the source, yes. Despite losing territory, despite being ruled by others, Armenian national consciousness didn't just survive, it kept evolving. It even mentions how the sort of push and pull between the Persians and Ottomans ironically contributed to forming certain stereotypes.
And then there was this big push towards modernization leading up to the 20th century.
Yeah, this was a really crucial phase. From the 18th century right up to 1915, the source describes this complex, intense process of modernization. It was all about intellectual and cultural awakening, looking towards Europe as a model. And it really underpinned this growing national consciousness, cultural awareness, identity.
The source uses specific Armenian words for this, right?
It does. The intellectuals at the time used terms like rebirth, vraknund, and awakening, Zartank. The starting point is often linked to 1784, with the Mekhitar's Catholic monastic order over in Venice.
And this led to a real boom in culture.
Oh, definitely. By the mid-19th century, the sheer volume of publications was amazing. The source mentions over 1,000 books, periodicals, newspapers, covering all sorts of genres. You get this new intelligentsia emerging around the 1830s, philosophers, historians, writers, scientists. And this is also when the first Armenian political parties were founded.
But, and this is the tragic part the source points out, this cultural and intellectual energy couldn't translate into political freedom.
Exactly. That's the tragedy the source highlights. It explicitly says both internal issues and the external geopolitical climate basically block those national aspirations from becoming a political reality. Any attempts to push for reforms were met with horrific violence, like the massacres of 1894, 1896.
And the big European powers didn't really help.
The source notes they offered mostly just cautious concern, focused on humanitarian aid maybe, but left any real political change for some vague future date.
So attempts at armed resistance didn't work either.
The source says an effort to unify political forces for an uprising ultimately failed and actually led to more internal struggles. It wraps up this section by saying, look, instead of a risorgimento, that kind of national revival you saw in Italy, the Armenian people experienced the tragedy of genocide and dispersion.
Which brings us to an incredibly difficult and significant event described in the source. The Armenian Genocide. And we need to be really precise here, reporting only what's in the source material provided.
Absolute utmost care here. According to the source material we have, the Armenian Genocide, which it also refers to as the Great Crime, was the systematic extermination of the Armenian people. It states this was carried out by the Ottoman Empire and its successor state, the Republic of Turkey, primarily between 1915 and 1923.
Does the source provide a number for the victims?
Yes, it gives an estimated figure of 1.5 million Armenians killed during that period.
And its historical significance.
The source describes it as being considered one of the first genocides of the 20th century.
What key events does the text detail, particularly starting in 1915?
It lays out that the systematic actions began on April 24, 1915. That's when the Ottoman government initiated the mass deportation of Armenians from Istanbul, which the text calls their cultural and spiritual capital. Then, between 1915 and 1923, Armenians deported from Istanbul and also from eastern Anatolia were murdered during forced marches or killed in massacres, particularly in the Syrian deserts. The source really emphasizes that the vast majority of Armenians living in eastern Anatolia were annihilated. The survivors ended up scattered across the globe, creating this huge diaspora Middle East, Europe, North America.
The source mentions a specific detail about getting information out early on.
It does. It mentions a man named George Hasunian contacting the American ambassador Henry Morgenthau in Istanbul back in June 1915. He was passing on accounts from survivors that had been gathered by some kind of underground network. And the source notes that this specific letter is discussed in a British archive file titled Deportation and Massacre, a Record of Armenian Sufferings.
What context does the source offer regarding the diplomatic background or the lead-up to this?
It mentions the Armenian question being on diplomatic agendas back in the 19th century. It links it to the rise of the Armenian national bourgeoisie, the cultural activity we talked about, and then those earlier massacres of 1894, 1896. It reiterates that the major powers' intervention back then was pretty cautious, mostly focused on humanitarian aid, not major political change. The source also notes an Armenian delegation went to Paris in 1916, specifically asking for liberation and autonomy.
And what does the source say was the overall impact on the Armenian people?
It states that despite attempts by the Ottoman Empire to assimilate or Turkify them, it didn't completely hinder their survival as a distinct nation. However, the text is very clear that the Ottoman Empire bears crucial responsibility for the immense damage caused. The genocide led directly to this mass dispersion and, well, profound ongoing suffering.
How does the source describe the situation today regarding the genocide, recognition, and relations, especially with Turkey? Again, strictly based on the text.
Right. So the source frames this within the context of Turkey's geographical position and its history regarding ethnic minorities, mentioning Greeks, Kurds, Jews, and Armenians specifically. It states unequivocally that the exile from their ancestral lands is deeply engraved in Armenian memory.
And dialogue.
It notes that while there are no official diplomatic relations, there is a willingness, it says, from some Turkish citizens for dialogue with Armenian society. The source then discusses how the memory of the genocide significantly shaped the nationalist identity of Kemalist Turkey, contributing to a kind of taboo around the subject and reinforcing denial concerns among Armenians. It presents an idea mentioned in the source of a unique opportunity for mutual reconciliation, possibly arising from new discourses from both sides, but it immediately adds a caution that any results might not fully meet Armenian expectations.
It seems to paint a complex picture of Turkish society's response.
Very complex. The source contrasts some positive non-official initiatives happening since 2007 with what it describes as a racist and nationalist backlash from the Turkish pro-government elite, which has disappointed Armenians. It does mention that some Turkish citizens have researched the massacres and called for state accountability. It observed that within Turkish society, pride and guilt coexist regarding this history, often mixed with nationalist sentimentality or remorse that, according to the source, actually hinders deeper investigation. The source finishes that thought by questioning whether these actions by individual citizens trying to trace history responsibly can actually change official state practice. We're relaying this exactly as presented in the source.
Okay. Moving chronologically again into the 20th century, the Russian Revolution shook things up everywhere.
It certainly did. It created a brief, chaotic window. After World War I and the collapse of Tsarist Russia, an independent Republic of Armenia was declared. May 28, 1918.
But that independence was extremely short-lived.
Very short, according to the source. It faced immediate threats. The Young Turks apparently proclaimed Yerevan a Turkish city and invaded. There was some pushback with Russian help for a time, but ultimately, the First Republic couldn't withstand a Turkish offensive in 1920. The source uses the phrase, betrayed by the Allies, says its forces just melted away and the Republic collapsed.
Leading directly to becoming part of the Soviet Union.
Yes, Soviet rule was established December 27, 1920. The source makes it clear this came after brutal wars and huge massacres, and it resulted in Armenia losing almost all its historic territory, ending up with just a small republic based around the Ararat Plain. The text specifically mentions, in the context of the 1921 treaty, losing Sassoon to Turkey and Artsakh and Nakhchivan going to Azerbaijan.
Despite being under Soviet control, what does the source say about Armenian culture during that long period? Did it survive?
The material definitely highlights that, yes, even under the Soviet system, Armenian culture, their identity, language, religion, they were largely preserved.
Yeah.
It talks about the importance of their rich literature, all the written monuments, manuscripts. It also touches on some unique artistic aspects mentioned in the text, like the incredible early Christian churches, built with that volcanic tough stone, featuring the Armenian crosses, those unique domed, cross-shaped designs.
Architecture seems key.
Very key. The source also mentions stone carvings, beautiful miniature paintings and manuscripts, even engraved wooden or metal discs that reproduce the alphabet. It does briefly note the development of modern literary Armenian, mentioning Western and Eastern dialects and some 20th century spelling reforms influenced by Russia, but also points out some ongoing issues with standardizing scholarly writing during that time.
Oh, let's fast forward then to the late 20th century, the USSR starting to crumble. The source points to one specific event as a sort of trigger for change in Armenia.
Yeah, the Spitak earthquake in May 1988, a devastating earthquake. The source notes it acted as a catalyst for mass protest. It links the disaster to this underlying discontent with the Soviet system that had been ruling Armenia for 70 years, suggesting it really helped mobilize people.
And that paved the way for independence again.
It did. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed, Armenia restored its statehood in 1991. The source really emphasizes how significant this was, reestablishing a sovereign republic after more than 70 years under Moscow, and really for the first time in almost 600 years since the fall of Cilician Armenia.
But this new independence came with its own massive challenges, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Far from easy. The source details the struggles of the post-Soviet era, wars with Azerbaijan specifically highlighting the conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh, or Haut-Karabakh as the source also refers to it, and internal problems too, like what the source calls state capture by oligarchs, major issues with ethical governance, and it even mentions a coup d'etat attempt against those ruling oligarchs.
What kind of foreign policy vision did the new republic adopt, according to the source?
The source outlines the strategic vision based on four main pillars. 1. Security, mainly through military deterrence. 2. Economic security, trying to get growth, foreign investment. 3. Basing policy on international law, hoping to mitigate threats. And 4. Preserving that nation-state identity, diaspora, outreach, language, culture.
How did that evolve?
It notes that this policy evolved towards pragmatism and increasingly close ties with Russia. But the source states that warnings about growing Russian influence were largely overlooked, and this ultimately impacted progress on democratic reforms and Armenia's aspirations towards Europe.
And any specific notes on more recent political dynamics in the text?
Just briefly. It touches on things like an agreement on new political rules back in 2005. It highlights the important role civil society played in protests, mentions changes in administrative roles, concerns about leadership rotation in the future, and it nods to the dynamics between political factions and the opposition, referencing events around the 2003 elections and a government reshuffle in 2004, noting how policy tools were used in those negotiations.
It really feels like this whole history is defined by Armenia's position, stuck at this global crossroads, which brings us neatly to the diaspora, right? That huge global community.
Yes, absolutely. Armenia's historical location, constantly between empires, Roman, Byzantine, Arab, Persian, Ottoman, Russian, and then major events like the genocide, they all led to this significant dispersion over centuries. That's how you get the large global Armenian diaspora that exists today.
And the source describes identity as being pretty complex for them.
It really does. The source talks about this complex landscape for Armenians, both in the homeland and living abroad. There's this constant push and pull, integrating into new countries versus preserving Armenian heritage. But it also notes that despite the challenges, the diaspora has built these incredibly rich community lives and maintains really strong bonds and networks back with Armenia.
What specific challenges within the diaspora does the source mention?
It notes things like tendencies towards localism or maybe assimilation over time, how shifts in Armenia's own interests or policies can affect the diaspora relationship. It even mentions what it calls an apparent schism within Armenia itself, which can challenge that sense of connection for the diaspora.
Globalization plays a role too.
Yeah, the source suggests globalization brings this kind of homogenization indifference, making it harder to maintain distinct community and ethnic ties. It also mentions a relative neglect in some parts of the diaspora of traditional culture and folklore as maybe a sign of fragility.
And Armenia itself, the country, still faces pretty big concerns as a small nation.
The source definitely highlights that. Ongoing challenges in a really volatile region, facing instability, adversaries, and this persistent fear, it says, of being lost or overwhelmed. It mentions that many people in the diaspora are witnessing what it calls the bitter testimony of the past and the despair of life in an insecure and irrevocably changed homeland.
How do all these layers, history, identity, diaspora experience, shape political views and engagement?
Well, the source discusses how these different layers of national identity result in quite varied political attitudes. It uses the example of American Armenians. They might identify primarily as American, but still be deeply invested in Armenian affairs. It also touches on the complexities around political representation for Artsakh and how diaspora engagement differs on contemporary issues compared to, say, attitudes towards Azerbaijan, which are often deeply linked to the memory of the genocide and the idea of the motherland.
We've covered a huge amount of ground here, tracing this story through the sources from those earliest settlements, the rise and fall of ancient kingdoms, through centuries of being ruled by others, that absolutely pivotal moment of adopting Christianity and getting the alphabet, the immense tragedy of the genocide, the whole Soviet period, and now the complexities of modern independence and this global diaspora life.
It's a history defined by incredible pressures, constant conflict, profound tragedy. But as the sources consistently show, it's also a story of remarkable cultural innovation, just extraordinary resilience, and this persistent, stubborn preservation of a unique identity against, frankly, overwhelming odds.
Yeah, it really makes you think of that poet quoted in the sources reflecting on the Armenian destiny, the idea that despite everything, they've been beaten, but Armenians have lived, live, and will live again. That capacity for survival through centuries of unbelievable hardship, including genocide, it's just striking.
The depth of that endurance, it just comes through so powerfully in this historical account provided.
It really does. And it leaves us with a lot to think about, doesn't it? Given this centuries-long struggle to preserve identity, language, culture against relentless external pressures, internal divisions, immense tragedy, and considering the reality of this massive global diaspora today, what does this unique history suggest about the very nature of nationhood, maybe, and cultural survival in our own 21st century? That's the question we'll leave you with to ponder as you reflect on this deep dive into the history of Armenia.